So the basic idea for conditioning is more based around your neutrals and your neutral excels more than anyone gives it credit to. Generally, people like to say like, oh, like if you do an attack a certain amount of times, right? So like they say, if I LMB Peony, twice, then that means like the feint is good from there because I've just conditioned him for the LMB. Therefore, he wants to parry it. It's actually more in depth than that. Generally, when you're conditioning people, you need to make sure that a couple of criteria is met, such as that 1, you are sitting in neutral. 2, you are making them parry as early as physically possible. And 3, whatever you're trying to do, like for the condition, it is like adequately like conditioned for in the sense of the like previous 2 criteria, right? So like let's say for instance, I want to underhand morph him. If I just like do this and like do really late excels, he can use that window, or not really like drags, right? If I only drag my underhand, he can just use that really late window to ignore the first, let's say like 200 100 milliseconds of the underhand, and that gives him time to actively read. And so when you're conditioning, generally you want to always give them as little time as possible, right? And the way we establish that is we try to recognize when our weapon is in release, right? So like all of this is wind up, and we'll go into like feints and wind up and all that stuff later. But generally, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make your opponent parry as early as possible, which is, their parry window is around 950 milliseconds. So you can get around that 950 millisecond window of their parry. So like if I were to, to figure out release, right? So you can go off of grunt, or you can go off of draw tracers. I like to go off of draw tracers. A good way of doing this is going in third person, turning on draw tracers, and swinging your sword, right? So all of this is wind up, and all of this is pointless. So players that like look at the ground and do this generally is actually wrong, because what you're doing is you're telling your opponent what you're doing, right? When I do this, I have the same options as I would have from neutral, except for the fact that I will not be able to drag this without telling him that I have to drag it, right? So like if I want to drag this, I have to pull up before it enters release, because if it enters release, it's just going to hit him instantly, right? So what I'm doing is in windup, which, windup means nothing pretty much, other than like if you're conditioning them for feints or stuff, if your previous conditioning doesn't work. In windup, I'm telling him that I'm dragging, right? He can watch my head movement and see my head move in the opposite direction, telling him that I'm not committing with the excel. So generally what you want to do is you want to stay as neutral as possible. You want to put your crosshair on their chest or their head. You want to recognize when your weapon enters release. As soon as your weapon, so if we were to go in slow-mo, slow-mo 0.1. If you were to go in slow-mo, as soon as your weapon enters release, so like right now, when the draw tracer appears, that is weapon release, and that means your weapon can finally do damage, and that is when you want to move your weapon. You never want to move your mouse or move your sword or anything until you've entered release. So if I were to try to condition Peony, if I condition him like this and like go for these neutral drags, he can ignore a good 100 to like 150 milliseconds of release, which is very bad. So when you're conditioning, you want to make sure you're always trying to flick to excel. That way, all of your release, as soon as you enter release, he has to parry. So now that we've established that as soon as we enter release, he has to parry, now he's being conditioned for as soon as my weapon enters release, he has to react in some way, whether it be a chamber dash, whether it be a parry. He has to react to what we're doing as soon as we enter release. Whereas if we were to just input like this, he can wait and delay his reaction. That gives him time to activate, that gives him time to react to what we're doing. And so the whole idea with conditioning is that you're making sure that all your swings, as soon as they enter release, are forcing him to parry. That way we get the most time that we can to get around his 950 milliseconds of parry, right? So conditioning still applies in the sense that if you overhead him enough, then he'll want to like parry your overheads or whatever, so the feint is good. But generally, if you're conditioning wrong, sometimes you'll feel as if like certain animations are just bad, whereas most of the time you can do anything should you, flick to excel and condition it correctly. Okay. So generally, when we talked about previously conditioning, and that was in the sense of conditioning for your swings, right? So previously we talked about making sure that all your swings have value by flicking to excel into them, so they parry as early as possible, so we get around the parry. There is a second form of conditioning, which is the idea of like patterns, and Wizards talks about this a bit. Is like recognizing patterns and being able to punish the patterns, right? So the basic idea is let's say for instance, right, I hit Peony with the LMB feint that I only do this one certain animation for, right? Should he parry and fall for that, he should know the animation that I want to look for out of a pattern for that feint, right? And so everyone generally, you need to stay neutral, and you need to make sure all your animations are the same. They're all readable, blah, blah, blah. We'll get into that in a minute. But what you want to do for another level of conditioning is you want to punish what they believe is the correct options. Like, let's say, for instance, Peony thinks, like, I'm always turn capping these LMBs, so his response is to chamber jump it, right? So if he just starts chamber jumping my overheads, then the correct response to punish it and make sure he doesn't want to do that is to pull up and punish him for that overhead by pulling up and past him and toe dragging him like through the chamber, right? And so now we start like throwing that in, then he won't want to do that anymore because he's getting punished for it. It's the same idea for chambers, where if Peony wants to chamber this LMB, right, I can just drag it, make him CFTP out of the chamber if I can, or hit him for it and punish for him, and he won't want to chamber anymore. And so that's another way of conditioning and making sure your feints are good, is trying to always punish players for chambering so they won't want to chamber anymore by neutral dragging, right? This applies for your morphs as well. Generally, a way that people deal with morph feints a lot of the time is they try to read the first animation and then they try to chamber the second animation, right? So if I want to like stab Morph Peony, he'll try to read this stab and to respond to the overhead. That way, no matter what I do with the overhead, he'll just chamber it, right? So a good response to that, which a lot of players do, is the chamber morph drag, or the morph drag, where you morph and then immediately drag, or try to drag, I didn't drag there, to try to punish his chamber, right? Because we don't want him chambering our morphs, because if he's chambering our morphs, then he's just going to chamber our morph feints, right? And we need our morph feints to be deadly. This is the same for feints, this is the same for every swing. Making sure you are constantly throwing in neutral swing manip, making sure they don't want to chamber so your feints are good is really, really important. And that's a big part of conditioning that is almost totally separate from neutral to excelling your neutral, so they are conditioned for morphs and feints and such. Okay, feed me a repost, Beanie. So generally, the way you want to repost people, of course, you want to condition for your reposts the same way you would anything else, right? So you want to make sure your reposts, they're always scared of the excel, and you're always excelling them with a repost should you be repost trading over and over again. Generally, the opposite side that you decide to parry is going to be better, a better animation for your repost than the side you were to parry, right? So for instance, Peony just like feed me a parry here. Actually, let me do it in slow motion. 0, 4, 5. Okay, feed me a parry. So should I parry right, I'll want to input left for the JPEG animation, because those animations are generally harder to read because they don't animate it as much as they enter release. So always parrying the opposite side that you enter release on is generally always a good thing to do for your reposts, as well as understanding what your opponent is doing footwork wise, right? So we saw in the defense video that generally you want to always make sure your footwork is neutral until your opponent lets your swing fly, and then you decide to either run into it or out of the swing turn cap, right? It's the same for offense, where you want to generally wait as long as you can to decide what they're going to do with their footwork, and then what you should do to punish it, right? So like we saw a second ago, there's a way to punish, the jump chamber with the overhead, right? And there's a way, if someone's sprinting into your swings, you just turn cap your swing to punish them, right? If they're walking away, you just neutral drag it. Some people may not understand this, and I might make a section of this, but I probably am not. But generally, there's always a swing manip for a certain type of footwork, and there's always an answer to everything in this game. You should figure out and understand what your opponent's going to do, right? So, Peony, feed me a repost. So here, I think trying to neutral out Peony and try to figure out what his footwork is going to be a lot better than just committing to like a casino drag, as you would call it, right? I shouldn't just like turn cap a swing because I'm going to risk missing him here like I did there, right? I want to wait and play neutral and try to recognize what type of footwork pattern he has, and then try to find the perfect swing for that footwork pattern, right? So it's a little bit, I'd say Peony's footwork pattern here is a little bit more than neutral. So I should go just past what I would consider neutral with my swing, and I feel like it hit Peony pretty consistently. Of course, you need to condition for your excels for this to work. You should never assume that all drags are always going to land and there's always a drag answer. A good amount of the time, players will just ignore your excels, eat the excels, and then just die. But they'll never die to drags because they'll just disrespect the threat that your repost has excel wise, and so they can ignore instantly getting hit. They won't have to actually put up their 950 millisecond parry window, and then they can just wait for your swing to be in release and get close to them, and then look to parry it, right? So you have to make sure you're conditioning for your repost just as much as you're conditioning for everything else. But if you can recognize their footwork, there's always a swing for every type of footwork, the same way in defense where you want to recognize their swing before you actually footwork. So generally, something else that's super important is the distance between you and your opponent for everything you do, right? So the closer you are to your opponent, the more threatening all of your swings are going to be, right? So if I, for instance, feint Peony from here, okay, all right, parry the swing, noob. A swing from here is much more unreadable than like a swing from here, right? I can still reach him, but because the animation is so much closer to him and the excel will be that much faster, he's going to be much more respectful of this swing. But that also puts us in danger of kick range, right? So like we're in kick range right here. Should he want to, right? If I input a overhead and he just kick me, right? Just kick me when I input an overhead, right? No, as you see the overhead come, just kick me, right?
Okay, yeah.
His kick is always going to be faster, even when he's the one reacting to our response, than my swing is going to be, right? So if I ever wind up, because my wind up's so long and kick is so fast, if I wind up in his face, he can just kick me, and if I don't headshot him, he won't get hit, right? So generally, what we want to do is we want to stay outside of kick range, but we still want to be as close to them as possible, right? So you can turn on draw tracers, you can see kicks, so you know the kick range for all that. But a good understanding for kicks is go back into your square, Peony. A good way to understand kicks is like, kick me from here, Peony, kick me. From here, his kick will reach, whereas if I went to the side of him, his kick wouldn't reach, right? So generally, when you are threatening people in face hug, instead of moving into them, you want to move like to the side of them with your swing, right? So feed me a riposte, Peony. So should Peony hit me like this, I'd want to move past him to his right, putting my sword animation into him so it's as close to him as possible, right? But I don't want to move directly into him. That's a big issue and a big fallacy that Mordhau players have, where they will sit in a square, Peony, where they will run directly into a player like this, and then their swing will just be to their right or to the left, whereas you could just be running past that player, stay out of kick range, and put your swing wind up inside of them, right? So that's something that's really important, and that's something you should really like notice in your offense is you want to always be moving past people, putting your animation towards them instead of running into people, right? So should I run past him with a morph like this, it's going to be much scarier than should I like sit here out of kick range and morph him from here, right? Because I'm out of kick range here, and I'm also out of kick range here, but the animations are much closer to him here than they would be from all the way back here. Something else that's really important is recognizing the wind-up times for your weapons. So if we go and we check the wind-up time of the wind-up of the greatsword, we have around half a second of a morph or feint window. I'm not certain if there's early release or if you can't feint or whatever in early release. I know there's a section in between your wind-up and release where you can't actually feint. I'm not certain exactly what that is, but generally I like to assume that you have at least like 500 milliseconds to morph or feint, and that actually changes with your ping. Right, so if you go and play and you play on 80 ping, you'll find that your morphs are a lot worse than you were if you were on 20 ping. That's because the morph window actually gets bigger or smaller, and the feint window, depending upon your ping. The better ping you have, the bigger your feint window, the bigger your morph window. It's a big reason why the best neutral players have always been like 20 ping players, and it's a big reason why neutral playstyle is really hard to do if you're a high ping player. So generally, you want to make sure you are always getting the most you physically can out of your windows for morphs and feints. A good way of doing that is to always just let it fly if it's going to, right? So what you'll do is you'll input a stab or whatever you want your morph start to be, and then you'll coin flip whether you actually let the morph go through, right? So I'll stab, and I'll try to morph so late that I'm not actually certain whether it's going to morph or not, right? And that's okay, because I'm trying to find the perfect window of opportunity for as late as the morph is going to be, right? And by doing this a bunch, I'll figure out where that window is, and I'll get more adjusted to it. And you'll subconsciously figure out kind of where that window is and how much time you actually have. Making sure you're always maximizing your feint windows and your morph windows is super important if you're going to try to play neutral, especially if you're trying to condition them to not want to chamber and to feint them and stuff. The deeper your feint is and the deeper your morph is, the much harder and harder it's going to get to read because you're that much closer to just instantly hitting them with it, right? So that's really important to do. So Bastard Sword Duels is a really good way to understand the old skill cap, and like it kind of applies now. Generally, the skill cap now for duels is much more riposte centric because chambers are so strong that riposte are the only consistent counter to them, and so rats are so prevalent and it bleeds into everything, right? So you'll see like stand weapons being more prevalent than Bastard Sword, but should you want to improve and move forward for a skill cap that like the community kind of desires, Bastard Sword is a very good way to understand the skill cap completely, because it's as unreadable as possible. And so what it is it forces you into reading patterns and mitigation, and purely working on mitigation defense and reading patterns, right? So the offense for Bastard Sword is pretty simple, right? Like we said before, you look to neutral excel, neutral flick install them into them. Hold on, let me toggle damage so Peony doesn't die. You look to neutral excel flick into them, and then you look to morph, right? So morphs is really important to put into your offense, because morphs are a 7 stam, basically unpunishable feint should you condition for it correctly, right? So some morphs are readable now, so stab to morph is pretty readable now with the stab nerfs, right? But like overhead to morph is still hard to read as long as you're conditioning for the overhead correctly. LMB headshot into morph is still hard to read as long as you're conditioning correctly. And essentially the strength of morphs is that it is unpunishable, right? So let's say for instance, Peony and I are like down to 30 stam, right? And then all of a sudden I just decide to feint Peony. Okay, if he chambers that swing, I lose out on 17 stam and my initiative. Okay, that is horrible. That is like absolutely horrendous. So let's say for instance I were to morph him instead. Let's say, I attack Peony and some morph. If he chambers that swing, I get to punish his morph, and I don't lose out on my initiative or any of my stamina, right? So morphs are a much safer, less volatile way to basically achieve the same thing as a feint and throw in mix-ups as well, right? So morphs are really, really, really important to throw in into your offense and mix them in, right? And then on top of that, like we said before, Bastard Sword is going to help you learn like the skill cap. So if you're having issues with like let's say kick range, like Bastard Sword dueling your buddy who's like around about your skill level or better than you is going to be helpful a lot, because it's going to teach you the range of kicks and then like running out of kicks, right? So because Bastard Sword is so small, I can look to like punish him with kicks because he wants to get as close to me as possible, and then I can look to kick his animations, right? Or it'll help you with basic mitigation, right? If he wants to underhand me, I can look to chamber dash the underhand like this, or if he wants to overhead me with it, I can look to jump chamber it and then only look for the morph, right? And so Bastard Swords bring out a lot of the artificial sides of the game that you wouldn't normally see, maybe just reposting with Greatsword, right? You'd only really see footwork and then maybe mitigating swing manip. Whereas with Bastard Sword, it's a lot more about mind games, reading in neutral, and artificial mitigation, such as like footwork or how you deal with swings in general.